Hey guys, tonight we sneak barefoot through volcanic ash. Your fingers brush crumbling stone as you shuffle deeper into the shadows of an ancient, ruined walls still stained by the soot of a 2,000-year-old apocalypse. There's no torch in your hand, but you feel the faint heat of bodies long gone, lingering like perfume on an old scarf. You're standing in what used to be the Lupanar of Pompeii, Rome's most infamous brothel, and the air is so thick with memory, it almost sticks to your skin. A woman once leaned against this same doorway, eyes cold dark and sharp as obsidian, whispering a price that didn't include affection. A man stumbled out of that room over there, belt askew, giggling like a boy who'd just broken curfew. You're not supposed to be here. And frankly, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where and when you're watching. From midnight in Manila, dawn in Dublin? I want to know what time you're stepping into this story. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear the brothel before you see it. Not the moans, that's just imagination, but the echo of sandals on stone, and the murmur of Latin curses mixed with wine-slurred flirtation. Down here, buried beneath layers of ash, lies a business that outlived emperors, religions, and civilizations. A brothel so durable, it didn't just survive the Roman Empire, it survived the idea of the Roman Empire. And that's not an exaggeration. Most Roman institutions, governments, temples, even marriage crumbled when the empire fell. But this place, with its 5 stone beds, its crude wall paintings of sexual positions, like a 1st century IKEA manual, and its carved phallus road signs leading customers through dark alleys, kept going. Through plagues, crusades, and regime changes, it just kept going. That's the kind of historical cockroach we're talking about tonight. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. Just a squat, 2-story building with 9 rooms in stone. Slabs where mattresses once lay, but look closer. Above each room is a painting explicit, unapologetic, and purely functional. Want the girl in position 4? She's in room 3. No Latin required. The entire system worked like a drive-through, except instead of fries, you got Frida. No refunds, no cuddling, and no room for fantasy. The experience was entirely transactional, and the menu was painted on the wall. And yet, here's the twist. For the women who worked here, this stone dungeon might have been the closest thing to control they ever had. Historians still argue whether these women were slaves, freelancers, or somewhere in between. What we know is that many had names real, or not, scratched into the walls alongside prices and jokes. Some left warnings like, "Marigamus is a lousy lover," or poetic boasts like, "I screw better than Venus." If you pause long enough and squint at the chisel marks, you'll realize something unsettling. These weren't just sex workers, they were marketers, survivalists, and authors of their own graffiti gospel. One of the more notorious stories, Commies from a source outside Pompeii, the legendary Roman Empress Messalina. According to Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, would sneak out at night in a disguise and work anonymously in brothels, reportedly outlasting every other woman. They're in both stamina and customers. Now, whether this is fact or just a smear campaign from her enemies, no one can say for sure. But the story's longevity tells you something. It wasn't just the brothels that fascinated Rome. It was the idea of women wielding sexual power outside the confines of marriage, religion, or decorum. And then there's the fringe tidbit for tonight. In Pompeii, phallic symbols weren't always sexual. Sometimes they were lucky charms, literal good luck penises. You'd find them over ovens, in gardens, or hanging from children's necks. Nothing says sweet dreams like a baby wearing a protective penis pendant. The line between sacred and profane was so blurry, you could trip over it in a toga. So you're standing there, 1 foot in a lost world, watching the flicker of torchlight against frescoes of people who died too fast to say goodbye. And yet, their brothel lived. It adapted. When gods changed, it just swapped statues. When armies marched, it reopened under new management. And while the senators debated philosophy and generals planned their next conquest, someone down here was quietly counting coins, washing linens, and keeping the door open. Because empires rise and fall, but somebody, somewhere, is always paying for sex. The doorway narrows, and you duck instinctively, stepping into the belly of Pompeii's Lupanar, the oldest, most intact brothel from antiquity that archaeologists didn't just uncover, but practically tripped over. You feel the cool bite of stone beneath your feet, uneven and worn smooth by thousands of restless steps. The rooms are tiny, barely wide enough for 2 people to lie down without knees knocking against walls. And yet, this wasn't a place for comfort. It was an erotic assembly line. Each cell had its stone bed built into the wall, covered back, then by something slightly softer than a sack of rocks. You try to imagine the rhythm of this place when it was alive. Door creaks, low laughter, coins clinking, the muffled negotiations of pleasure. And over everything, the constant thrum of business, business, business. Welcome to the Roman equivalent of fast food intimacy. Each room came with its own fresco painted above the doorway, just in case you didn't speak Latin or couldn't be bothered to ask questions. Position number 3, that's room 2. Want something more acrobatic? Try room 4, but bring a denarius and a good back. These weren't just decorations, they were instructions. The lupanar, from the Latin lupa, meaning she-wolf, popular euphemism for prostitute, functioned on efficiency. The sex wasn't necessarily sacred or even sensual. It was commodified, predictable, and brutally unromantic. But what fascinates you most isn't what happened on the beds, it's who ran this place. Historians still argue whether the brothel was owned by a freedwoman, a wealthy patron, or run as part of a larger criminal network. What we do know is that the women here, many enslaved, some possibly independent, had names. And those names are still scratched into the walls. Fortunata, Daphne, Cressa. One proudly etched, Atis hic fututa sum. I was here and had sex with Atticus. Another simply left a tally, like a scoreboard. It's graffiti, but it's also branding. In a society where women's voices were often silenced, these crude little scribbles become declarations of existence. There's a strange dignity in that, even when wrapped in humiliation. And it wasn't just local men visiting. Pompeii was a port city, crawling with sailors, traders, travelers. People from Africa, Greece, Egypt, Judea, all passing through, all fluent in the universal language of coin and craving. The lupanar served them all. No prejudice, just pricing. Some rooms had a stone lip on the bed's edge to stop customers from rolling off mid-activity. Others were etched with tally marks, possibly from bored clients or overworked attendants. There were no windows. The only light came from flickering oil lamps and the occasional shaft of sun slicing through a ceiling hole. The brothel itself was part of the city's official infrastructure, not some hidden den of shame. Streets literally led to it, with carved phallus symbols pointing the way like GPS for your libido. These weren't scrawled by vandals. They were part of the city's signage, like a Starbucks logo, but ruder. In fact, phallic imagery was everywhere in Pompeii. On fountains, on mosaics, even in bakeries where a lucky penis charm might hang above your sourdough. And while today's tourists snicker at the wall paintings, ancient visitors wouldn't have blinked. The Romans didn't have our modern squeamishness. For them, sex was just another transaction. Like buying olives, though possibly less nutritious. There's a popular story from the erotic spirit, Through History by Peter Webb, about a client who left a message on the wall for a favorite. Girl named Maritima. She moaned like a goddess, but stole my ring. It's petty. It's funny. It's so deeply human. And that's what makes this brothel feel less like a ruin and more like a time machine. You're not just seeing ancient sex work. You're seeing customer reviews, office drama, and passive-aggressive notes written in stone. But then comes the quirky detail of the night. One of the rooms, room 5, features a wall painting of 2 figures in an impossible pose. Impossible, not for anatomical reasons, but because one of them is clearly wearing socks, red ones, in bed, in the middle of summer. Historians still can't agree on whether this was a joke, a fashion statement, or just artistic laziness. But it adds a weird kind of charm. Even 2,000 years ago, someone was ruining the mood by refusing to take their socks off. So you lean against the wall. The frescoes paint faint but stubborn, and you wonder who chose these images, who painted them, who looked up at them with a sigh and said, "That'll do." Because in the end, this place wasn't just about sex, it was about survival. It was about power, who had it, who sold it, who faked it for a little while just to get through the day. The women here weren't romantic figures or erotic fantasies. They were workers in the truest sense, clocking in, clocking out, carving out autonomy between the cracks of a system designed to erase them. And somehow, the building remembers. You move past the stone bunks, ducking through another arched corridor that smells faintly of sulfur and damp stone. And now the air feels different, thicker, like the weight of unspoken rules is pressing against your ribs. The myth you've been sold, the postcard version of ancient Rome, tells you this was a sexual paradise. Men and women free to indulge every whim, unburdened by shame, dancing through orgies with wine-drenched laughter and 0 consequences. But let's hold that fantasy under a brighter light for a second. Because here's the truth you start to feel in your bones as you walk. Roman sexuality wasn't liberated, it was deeply hierarchical. You didn't get to enjoy pleasure freely. You got to enjoy it if you were on the right rung of the social ladder. If you were male, adult, and citizen, congratulations, Rome handed you a metaphorical buffet plate. But if you were female, enslaved, foreign, or just poor, your sexuality wasn't a right. It was a resource, one you could be forced to spend without consent, dignity, or even the decency of privacy. Historians still argue whether Roman society's obsession with sex was progressive or oppressive. On the one hand, they didn't demonize desire like later Christian Europe. On the other, desire was weaponized. The Romans didn't define sex as who you love, but as who's doing what to whom. The power dynamic was everything. Penetration meant dominance. Being penetrated? Submission. And that dynamic extended beyond the bedroom. It mapped directly onto politics, class, and empire. A victorious general might parade a captured king in chains, not just to show military conquest, but to imply sexual humiliation. Even the language was soaked in it. So imagine, for a moment, that you're not a paying customer wandering these halls, but one of the women inside, say, someone like Cytheris. She was a real figure, a former slave who became a professional courtesan and later a performer. For a brief, controversial moment, she became the lover of Mark Antony and traveled with him publicly, a scandal so enormous that senators reportedly choked on their figs. Cytheris didn't hide. She walked beside him like a wife. She broke the unspoken rule that said pleasure should be consumed, not embodied, by women. And for that, Rome did what Rome always did: immortalized her in gossip, and erased her from the honors. Meanwhile, elite Roman men played by different rules. Emperors like Tiberius reportedly kept entire islands for sexual pleasure, filled with boys, girls, and even mechanical contraptions historians aren't entirely sure how to interpret. But let's leave the nightmares on Capri for later. Tonight, let's talk about a more grounded example from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings. Emperor Augustus, the great moralist, publicly praised virtue while privately hosting sex parties disguised as religious festivals. His daughter Julia was later exiled for being promiscuous, though her lovers were often selected for political strategy. If that smells like hypocrisy to you, welcome to Roman politics. And while all this drama played out among the elite, the brothel kept grinding, transactional, efficient, merciless. But even in this mechanical world, there were brief flickers of intimacy, or at least attempts at it. Take the graffiti from a woman named Murtis. Felix, your touch was gentle. Come again. It's not Shakespeare, but it's raw. Maybe she meant it. Maybe it was bait for repeat business. Either way, it's there scratched into the wall, hoping for a second round. Then comes tonight's quirky footnote: Roman marriage contracts. Yes, ancient prenups were a thing. Some included clauses like, he shall provide her with 1 pair of sandals per year, or she shall not be away from the home for more than 3 nights in a row. Love wasn't the point, property was. Marriage was legal alignment. Sex was often outsourced. That's why brothels thrived. Why courtesans had fan clubs. Why senators penned poetry about their favorite performers, while making laws that denied them citizenship. And here's the quiet contradiction pulsing through it all. The society that flaunted sexual imagery, legalized prostitution, and celebrated virility also prized feminine chastity above all else. A virgin daughter was a political asset, a faithful wife, a trophy. But an experienced woman? That was a threat. So the state invented categories to manage the discomfort. Vestal virgins. On one end pure, sacred, untouchable. Brothel workers on the other legal, visible, disposable. Both imprisoned in their own way. As you lean against the cold wall, maybe you notice your breath fogging slightly in the air. The same walls that once echoed with laughter and rustling tunics now hold silence like a secret. And you think, freedom in ancient Rome wasn't measured by who you loved or what you desired. It was measured by who you were allowed to be when no one was watching. And for most, especially the women, the answer was not much. You pause near a corner where torchlight once cast shadows that danced like ghosts. And it hits you, not the smell, not the chill, but the fact that every inch of this place was sacred. Not sacred like temples and hymns. Sacred like lipstick on a used cigarette, or the kind of eye contact you only make with someone who knows what you're hiding. Because the lupanar wasn't just about sex, it was about ritual, charm, magic, and superstition. Welcome to the part of the brothel where God shared shelf space with scented oils, where pleasure was a prayer and protection came shaped like a phallus. And no, you didn't mishear that. The Roman god Facinus, protector of generals and babies alike, was literally a flying penis. Carved in wood, cast in bronze, hung from soldiers' necks as amulets. And yes, he had his own priesthood. The Romans had a god for door hinges, another for mildew, and of course, a divine wong to bless your bathhouse visit. If that doesn't put you in the mood for a little cultural reflection, nothing will. Historians still argue whether these sexual spiritual overlaps were genuine belief or just very convenient branding. But here's what's certain: the brothel was a place thick with ritual. Before a session, some women tied magical knots in their hair to ensure the client paid in full. Some rubbed themselves with oil infused with crushed rose petals and goat fat, both fragrant and suspiciously sticky. Love spells were slipped under mattresses, invoking Venus or Aphrodite to bind someone's heart, or at least their wallet. It wasn't enough to be beautiful, you had to be blessed too. And customers weren't immune. One popular talisman was a bronze hand holding a phallus and a snake. You wore it not just to brag, but to ward off envy, disease. And because Rome was weird like that, bad farming weather. In one brothel ledger, rediscovered by archaeologists and poorly preserved in wax tablets, a woman named Scintilla was said to have offered services of the mouth, prayers to Venus included. The suggestion is subtle, but clear. Sex wasn't just physical, it was spiritual insurance. And that's not a Roman quirk. It echoes through every era. As Peter Webb notes, in the erotic spirit through history, cultures often wrapped eroticism in religious garb to both elevate and contain it. In ancient India, the Kama Sutra wasn't porn, it was philosophy. In Mesopotamia, priestesses of Ishtar offered sacred intercourse as divine communication. So Pompeii, in its own smoky street-level way, was part of a global pattern. But here comes your quirky detail of the night crocodile dung. Yes, crocodile poop, sometimes mixed with honey and resin, was believed by Egyptians and some Romans to act as a contraceptive when inserted strategically. It sounds absurd. It probably smelled worse. And yet, it reflects a desperate kind of agency. When law and medicine failed to protect women, they turned to anything curses, charms, ancient recipes to regain control over their own bodies. And the control wasn't just about fertility. In the lupanar, power flickered in the smallest things: the position of a statue, the tilt of a lamp, the whispered phrase before a session started. There's graffiti in one room that reads, "Felicio hic adoravit," Felicio worshipped here. Did he mean worship as in religious devotion? Or was that just a euphemism for mind-blowing sex? We'll never know. But it's tempting to. Imagine a man kneeling beside a stone bed, not just in lust, but in awe. Even the architecture plays along. Phalluses carved into paving stones pointed the way like arrows, not naughty graffiti, actual street signs. Some fountains had waterspouts shaped like erect members, promising fertility and clean hydration in one awkward package. And tucked in a corner of the brothel is a niche that likely held a household god, Lares or Priapus, there to keep the bad vibes out and the paying clients in. And let's not forget the story of the Vestal Virgin who, according to legend, escaped punishment for breaking her vow of chastity by claiming it was divine seduction. Instead of execution, she was reassigned discreetly, humiliatingly, to a lesser temple. Some sources even suggest she ended up in a religiously affiliated brothel. A stretch? Maybe, but Rome had a long tradition of pretending sin was sacrifice. If it made people feel better about their own appetites, that. So here you are, standing in a place that smells faintly of candle wax and soot, staring at a fresco where Venus reclines with a knowing smirk, and you realize this was never just about commerce. It was ceremony. Not holy, not clean, but meaningful. Each act on these stone beds echoed with wishes for love, for money, for escape, and sometimes for nothing more than a night without violence. That's its own kind of prayer you step into. The light for a moment, not sunlight of course, but that dim, amber glow that spills from a broken archway, as if the building itself is still trying to keep the mood low and sultry. Except everything's different now. The air is cooler, the colors faded, and the murals have cracked like tired skin, because the empire is dying. Rome is breaking apart like stale bread under the weight of its own indulgence, and you're standing in a brothel that somehow refuses to notice. The streets outside are filling with smoke. Barbarians are battering at the gates. Currency is tanking harder than a crypto crash. And yet here, someone is still changing the linens. The fall of Rome is not a single day, or even a single year. It's a slow, aching unraveling. But while emperors are assassinated and legions are deserting, the brothel endures by doing what it's always done best. Adapting. Gone are the official road signs shaped like phalluses. Now it's just word of mouth. The paintings are still there, but they're older, touched up with cheaper pigments. The clientele has changed: too fewer toga-clad senators, more mercenaries with scarred knuckles and half-paid wages. The women still offer the same menu, but with more whispers and fewer songs. The goddess Venus is quietly replaced with a new icon, sometimes a vague motherly figure, sometimes just a candle lit in the corner. This isn't spiritual evolution, it's rebranding. When the gods start packing up, the brothel simply swaps the decor. Historians still argue, Whether prostitution was ever truly legalized under the late Empire, or just tolerated like a roach in the pantry, too ugly to acknowledge, too useful to eliminate. But there's strong evidence that even as Rome's laws crumbled, its brothels were still listed in local tax records. One scrap of papyrus from the 4th century includes a detailed ledger: candles, linen oil, wine, body salves. It could be a hotel inventory if it didn't also include a column for performances, complete with price brackets. And here's where things get more complicated. Some of the women working now aren't slaves anymore. They're former slaves, freed under manumission clauses, but with nowhere else to go. Their legal status has changed, but the reality hasn't. They still take clients. They still sleep on stone beds. Only now they get to keep a cut. And maybe, if they're lucky, rent a small stall of their own. One story from Sex with Kings tells of a woman named Livia Cervana, a former courtesan who became so skilled in the art of seduction that she was kept on retainer by a fading Roman governor. Her job wasn't just sex, it was listening, flattery, and emotional management. When the governor was finally overthrown, she survived by shifting alliances, slipping out of politics and back into private life like smoke through a keyhole. Meanwhile, outside the brothel walls, things are falling apart spectacularly. Grain imports are failing. Pirates roam the Mediterranean again. Literacy is plunging. And the emperors? They're either praying for divine intervention or fleeing into villas with their favorite astrologers. The roads are no longer safe, which means fewer travelers and fewer clients. But the brothel responds in the only way it knows how, by expanding its services. Now you can get more than sex. You can get a warm meal, a message delivered, a letter written, if the girl is literate. In some cases, you can even hire a woman to weep at your funeral, because professional mourning was a real and oddly lucrative side hustle. The brothel has become less of a den and more of a community center. And while the empire burns, someone here is making soup. Your quirky tidbit for tonight. In the late Roman period, some brothels started offering silence rooms, tiny spaces where clients paid not for sex, but simply to lie in the dark beside someone. No touching, just warmth, breath, and a break from the chaos outside. It was intimacy without the transaction, and it cost almost as much as the real thing. Some scholars believe this was an early form of therapy, or maybe just evidence that even war-hardened men still needed softness. And if you listen closely, you might hear the scratching of a new kind of graffiti, not boastful or vulgar, but anxious. Someone writes, "The gods are leaving." Another says, "We are still here." These aren't advertisements. They're survival mantras, carved into plaster with the hope that if the gods won't answer, maybe history will. So you exhale, leaning against a wall that somehow still holds heat from lives long extinguished. The brothel, against all odds, has outlasted its empire, not because it was powerful, but because it was flexible. Empires need armies. Brothels need only people. And people, no matter the century, will always find their way back to each other. In the dark, you blink and the walls shift. Not the stones themselves, but the names. Latin is fading from the graffiti. Now the syllables bend toward Greek, Syriac, Armenian. The brothel hasn't collapsed, it's just changed empires. Rome is gone, officially, but the business survives under new branding. Welcome to the Byzantine era, where the saints frown harder and the politics get slipperier. But the customers still show up with coins in hand and expectations in their eyes. Everything is more discreet now. Crosses hang above doorframes. The old frescoes are plastered over, replaced with vague floral motifs or nothing at all. And yet, behind those same stone walls, the moaning continues, muffled behind a newfound obsession with guilt. It's not that sex has disappeared, it's that everyone is pretending it's something else. The brothel becomes a halfway house of contradictions. You're no longer just a client, you might also be a penitent. Some Byzantine bishops encouraged prostitutes to take in other fallen women, offering them a blend of salvation and employment. And while some genuinely tried to provide escape routes from exploitation, others simply rebranded the same work under a cloak of piety. Historians still argue whether this Christian involvement was rescue or re-domestication, whether these women were being redeemed or just recycled into new forms of servitude. The result? A woman might be scrubbing linens in the name of Mary by day and entertaining pilgrims by night. Absolution sold separately. You wander deeper into this new phase, where incense replaces perfume and the candlelight flickers just as suggestively, but with more whispering. Sex hasn't stopped, it's just been renamed. Euphemisms bloom like mold on the stone. Companionship, domestic aid, spiritual comfort. One recorded case tells of a woman named Theodora, not the Empress, but another working under the same name who lived in Constantinople's seediest quarter, and was known to quote scripture between sessions. Some said she was mad, others said she was blessed. She said, "The body is not the soul, and I sell only one." The legal codes shift too. Under Justinian's reforms, brothels were targeted, taxed, sometimes shuttered. But demand didn't vanish, it just went underground. Certain districts were unofficially designated for hospitality, with soldiers and traders steering their boots toward specific alleys after sunset. One Byzantine chronicle describes a place called the House of Quiet. Repentance, a name so passive-aggressively holy, it almost deserves a sitcom. Supposedly, men could visit for moral instruction, which often involved a lot of sighing, and strategically draped robes. And here's your historical sex story for the evening. The real Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, once performed as an actress and courtesan. According to Procopius, her act included miming Leda and the swan, except with live birds. Whether this was slander or performance art, no one knows for sure. But her rise from erotic performer to empress was legendary. She later pushed for laws that protected women from forced prostitution and offered safe houses for escapees. Yet paradoxically, those same laws also made sex work less visible, driving it into darker corners. The brothel didn't vanish. It just learned to whisper. And that's tonight's strange little fact. Byzantine brothels were sometimes required to hang a small lantern outside at night, not as an advertisement, but as a signal of compliance. You weren't allowed to brag, but you had to be findable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of flipping your open sign around at dusk. Light meant legality, and extinguishing it during patrols could lead to fines or worse. So now, in this incense-stained phase of history, the brothel doubles as both confession and transgression. A woman might recite prayers before each client, not because she believes, but because he does. A man might pay extra for silence, for the illusion of virtue, for the safety of denial. You lean into a corner and find new graffiti, this time scratched. In Greek, he wept after, I did not. The walls don't care what language they bleed in. They only record. It's quieter now. There are fewer customers. The empire is at war more often than not, and food is expensive. But the brothel adapts. Again, they start serving meals. They offer bandages. One former prostitute, according to a tattered legal petition, even trained in massage and bone setting to treat wounded soldiers at a discount, no less. And when she was denied citizenship, she added one last note in the margin. I have healed more than they have prayed. So you sit there, feeling the slow shift of centuries through the solace of your feet. The names on the walls change. The gods are swapped for saints, but the labor stays the same. The brothel survives not by defying the empire, but by melting into its cracks. It is both symptom and sanctuary, rejected, regulated, then required again. Always open, always glowing. The lamps dim again, but not because you've gone deeper underground this time, it's the architecture. The arches are pointed, the windows narrower, and the script on the walls has changed again. Arabic now, calligraphic and flowing, etched. In private corners or inked delicately on parchment, tucked beneath stones. You're not in Rome anymore, or even Byzantium. The empire has changed hands again, and the brothel, ever adaptable, is now breathing beneath the reign of the Islamic caliphates. But don't expect a neon sign. Here, discretion is more than survival, it's elegance. Brothels still exist, but the word for them has changed. So has the atmosphere. No more blunt frescoes of acrobatics. No carved phalluses pointing the way. Now it's whispers behind lattice windows, a glance from behind a veil, a coded poem left in the margin of a book of verses. You feel it instantly. The rules have changed, but the hunger hasn't. The brothel is less of a building now, more of a network. Hidden in hammams, back rooms of inns, even disguised as tea houses or schools of poetry. And while religious law officially condemns sex work, it also, paradoxically, regulates it. Under certain caliphates, women engaged in the trade were allowed to register, pay taxes, and even organize in guilds. Historians still argue whether this was tolerance, hypocrisy, or pragmatic governance. But the result was unmistakable. The work continued, wrapped in modesty but untouched in essence. One particularly fascinating character emerges from this era, a woman named Jamila al-Muqaddimah, who lived in the 10th century and was considered both a courtesan and a scholar. She knew 4 languages, could recite the Quran by heart, and was paid handsomely to perform poetry and allegedly more intimate services for elite clientele. She was not hidden. She was invited to salons. Men sought her opinion on theology, the tween flirtations. She lived in contradiction and somehow thrived there. In this world, sex is no longer advertised, it's implied. The Kama Sutra, still circulating in translation, survives not as a manual but as a philosophical text. Love, here, is spiritual geometry. Even brothel rooms are decorated less with images and more with verses. Instead of wall paintings of positions, there's a couplet inked in fine calligraphy. The touch of the beloved is softer than jasmine, but sharper than truth. You can almost hear it whispered through a curtain, just before the lamp is blown out. And here's your curious tidbit. Islamic medicine at the time was leagues ahead of Europe's. In some brothels, women were given access to herbal contraceptives, derived from silphium, rue, or pomegranate peel. One preserved manual even includes a recipe for sweet vinegar oil to be used before intercourse, not as perfume, but as protection. Whether it worked is debatable, but the knowledge was there, written by women, copied by midwives, and passed along like an heirloom of resistance. The graffiti's gone, replaced now by coded language. But if you listen closely, you'll hear a love poem being rehearsed behind a silk curtain. It might be performance. It might be foreplay. In some cases, women in these spaces weren't just sellers of sex, they were courtesans trained in music, philosophy, debate. Men came for stimulation of the mind as much as the body. And often, they left stunned by both. But this wasn't utopia. Many of these women were still enslaved. Others were orphans or war captives, trained for this work since childhood. And while some rose to wield influence, most were invisible, hidden behind clients, behind curtains, behind shame. Still, the brothel existed. Not because it was protected, but because it was inevitable. A secret tolerated by cities that needed what it offered, but couldn't admit it out loud. One story from this era, preserved in a dusty folktale anthology, tells of a man who fell in love with a woman he met in a bathhouse. She recited Rumi while washing his feet. He returned for weeks, refusing to touch her, just listening. When she finally disappeared, he wrote her name on a piece of pottery and buried it in the garden, convinced the earth itself would remember her. It's probably fiction, but it says something about the way intimacy survived in places where even eye contact was dangerous. So here you are again, bare feet on mosaic tiles, the scent of rose water in the air, and someone singing softly in a room you're not allowed to enter. The brothel has become a mirage, a shapeshifter. It changes accent, costume, language, but it never vanishes. Because the need it serves is older than law, more persistent than empire. And here, under the soft rustle of veils and velvet, it continues in the same rhythm it always has. Breath, touch, coin, silence. You hear coughing before you see the torchlight, a rasping, wet sound that clings to the walls like mildew. Then, the iron-clad boots come stomping in, and the scent of blood, damp wool, and cheap wine floods your senses. Welcome to the brothel during the age of crusaders and plague, when God's name is shouted from every banner and no one washes their hands. The world is breaking again, and yet the brothel, impossibly, is still open. The curtains are thinner, the ceilings lower, but someone is still knocking on the door after dark with coins in hand and a story to forget. War doesn't kill the business, it makes it busier. Every time a crusade marches through, so does hunger, disease, and desperation. The sex trade becomes a relief valve for the chaos outside. And the strange part? The brothel doesn't just survive, now it's making deals. The church officially condemns prostitution, of course. Loudly, theatrically. But behind closed doors, it's a different story. Some monasteries collect sin taxes from local brothels. Others own the land they operate on. Historians still argue whether this was passive tolerance or strategic monetization. Either way, your favorite sin and your least favorite sermon are now on the same balance sheet. In fact, there are records of bishops investing in bathhouses that doubled as pleasure dens, provided the sins stayed profitable and the shame stayed quiet. A notorious example from the time involves a woman named Yebel of Rouen, known in court documents as both a courtesan and an information broker. Her clients included crusaders, nobles, and even papal envoys. She wasn't just selling sex, she was selling intelligence. Her pillow talk included troop movements and marriage plots. And when one nobleman tried to have her silenced, she responded by reading his letters aloud in court. Not exactly subtle, but effective. And here's your fringe tidbit. In plague-ridden cities, brothels often became makeshift hospitals, not officially, but functionally. Many sex workers became de facto nurses, cleaning wounds, boiling herbs, and tending to the dying. Why? Because they were already touching the untouchable. They already knew how to work with bodies no one else wanted to see. Some cities even allowed brothels to stay open during quarantines, under the theory that isolated sin was safer than roaming desire. It wasn't, but it tells you how society calculated risk. Meanwhile, graffiti is back, but rougher, more desperate. Scrawled in charcoal or etched with a dagger, the messages are part prayer, part profanity. One reads, "Better to die inside than outside." Another, "She kissed me and my fever broke." You don't know if that's poetry or delusion. Maybe both. Inside, the mood has changed. There's less ritual, more survival. The rooms are colder, clients drunker. But the women still decorate their spaces, tokens of hope clinging to the walls. A dried flower, a scrap of lace. A small mirror, cracked but polished daily. One woman, known only as Margot, was said to sing while she worked, not love songs, but lullabies. She claimed it calmed nervous clients and reminded her body that she was still human. And yet, beneath all this grimness, the brothel does something extraordinary. It starts using paperwork. Contracts, ledger books. A girl named Alex reportedly kept detailed accounts. How many clients, how much was earned, what was spent on bread and oil. She didn't write for history. She wrote to protect herself. But those little numbers are now gold mines for scholars, because they show that even in the blood-soaked haze of medieval Europe, someone was still balancing a budget while chaos knocked on the door. One of the more surreal moments comes from a court case in Marseille where a man claimed he visited a brothel only to confess his sins. The judge asked how long he stayed. He answered, 6 hours with interruptions for reflection. The brothel madam fined him for loitering. This was the era where contradiction ruled. You could be excommunicated and still receive communion. The next day, you could pay to pray and pay to stray in the same building. The same man might kneel at dawn and grope at dusk. And through it all, the brothel adjusted shifting tone, adjusting prices, hiding rosaries under bed sheets. So you walk through a room where the walls are damp with time, and the scent of old smoke lingers like regret. Outside, plague bells toll. Inside, someone pours wine into a chipped cup, hums a tune half remembered from childhood, and leans into another night of fragile business. The brothel hasn't just adapted, it has evolved. It now exists in tension between shame and need, between law and mercy, between sin and service. And in that thin, trembling space, it thrives. The lanterns glow differently, now no longer smoky clay bowls, but glass spheres that shimmer like stolen moonlight. The walls are smoother. The scent in the air is lavender and old ink. You're in the Renaissance, darling, where art flirts with anatomy and desire is no longer hidden. It's painted, sculpted, sung. And the brothel? It's thriving like a well-funded opera house. This isn't the dark backroom of sin anymore. It's the gray zone where courtesans and cardinals sip wine from the same chalice. Welcome to the age of legal loopholes and velvet ropes. Everything looks cleaner, but don't be fooled. The services haven't changed, only the packaging. You pass under an arch engraved with mythological figures, Venus, of course, but now also Daphne, Europa, Leda. All women caught between gods and pleasure. The message is clear. In this house, stories are currency, and every touch might come with a metaphor. And the brothel itself? It's no longer called a brothel. It's a salon, a house of muses, a private gallery. You knock not with desperation, but with poetry. The madam is dressed like a merchant's wife. The women wear silk, not rags. Some speak 3 languages. One critiques your taste in sculpture before asking your name. The Renaissance doesn't kill the brothel, it turns it into a boutique. Sex becomes performance, conversation, entertainment. And yet the core transaction remains. Desire, coin, time, secrecy. Take Veronica Franco, a real Venetian courtesan whose letters and poetry still survive. She wasn't just admired, she was feared, cited, scandalized. She debated scholars, seduced nobles, and once defended herself in court with such wit that the Inquisition dropped the charges. According to Eleanor Herman, she was considered the perfect companion because she could quote Plato after removing your shoes. Clients paid not just for her body, but for her mind, her company, and the status of being seen with her. Courtesans like her could influence policy, inspire painters, even ruin reputations. But beneath the lace and sonnets, they still lived under constant threat of disease, abandonment, or political scapegoating. Historians still argue whether this elevation of sex work was empowerment or exploitation wrapped in satin. Some women gained fortunes. Others were discarded the moment their novelty faded. The legal gray zone helped maintain the illusion. Technically, prostitution was restricted or taxed or banned, depending on the city and the day. But enforcement was selective. A well-placed bribe, a favor owed, a painting gifted. Suddenly, your salon was a private residence for entertaining guests. And here's your quirky historical gem. In Florence, the city's tax records included a category called Women of Unregistered Morality. It was a bureaucratic way to acknowledge, but not quite validate, the sex trade. These women were issued fines instead of licenses, meaning they were technically illegal, but economically indispensable. Some even kept official ledgers, noting clients' names in code alongside symbols like a small inked rose. for generosity, or a spider for stinginess. One brothel's records show that during Lent, when public morality spiked, prices actually increased. Scarcity, it seems, was profitable, and there was more than money at stake. The Renaissance was obsessed with anatomy, not just scientifically, but erotically. Artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli used the brothel as inspiration, and sometimes as studio. One unnamed courtesan reportedly posed for 6 different Virgin Marys and was paid in pearls and pasta. Another was used to model anatomical drawings, later claimed as medical research. Her identity? Lost, but her hips? Immortalized. The clients, too, had changed. They no longer arrived in shadow, they arrived in style. Scholars, nobles, clergy. Some carried books instead of swords. And yet they were still driven by the same aching need as the sailors in Pompeii: connection, escape, affirmation. The difference now was theater. Everything was performance. You didn't just lie with someone, you danced with their mind first. Flattery was foreplay. Latin quotations were lingerie. One famous account describes a courtesan who demanded her clients compose a sonnet before they touched her. If the verse was clumsy, they paid double. If it was beautiful, she recited it back during the act. Another allegedly kept a pet owl who stared from the corner of the room, silently judging the evening's proceedings. Whether real or apocryphal, these stories tell you something essential. The brothel had learned not just to survive, but to market itself as elite. And still, the risk never vanished. A courtesan who aged, angered the wrong man, or lost favor could vanish overnight, slandered as a witch, cast into poverty, or quietly locked away in a convent. The line between muse and monster was paper thin, but the brothel adapted again. It learned law. It studied art. It smiled at judges. And beneath the velvet and candles, someone was always keeping count. So here you are, standing in a room with gold-painted moldings and the lingering scent of rose oil, watching shadows flicker across a mirror too expensive for most kings. Realize the brothel hasn't just survived. It's learned how to wear the mask of legitimacy so well. Even history blushes to admit it. The empire has collapsed. The plagues have passed. But behind every red curtain, someone still whispers, still waits, still works. You return to the surface, now no longer climbing through ruins or brushing cobwebs off faded mosaics. You're walking on cobblestone polished by sneakers, listening to a tour guide butcher Latin while pointing toward a structure labeled simply Lupanar. It sits quietly under the Italian sun, half shadowed by lemon trees and camera flashes. This is the end of the journey, supposedly, but you know better. Because even as tourists giggle at ancient erotic frescoes and pose next to crumbling beds, the walls still hum with memory. The brothel may be a ruin, but the business it once embodied is not. It's very much alive, just in different clothes. Maybe you've passed it already today, tucked behind a spa, or masquerading as a wellness retreat. The facade evolves, the address changes, but the core remains. Nothing else from the Roman Empire survived intact, not the Senate, not the legions, not the gods, but the brothel, in one form or another, never closed. And here, among the fragments, the silence speaks loudest. There's no more laughter, no more footsteps echoing down the stone hall. But etched into the wall is one final piece of graffiti, almost erased by time. I was here. I was desired. I was paid. It's not a boast. It's a ledger entry, a heartbeat. And it lands harder than any history book ever could. Because behind every marble statue and triumphant arch, there were rooms like this. Quiet rooms, sweaty. Rooms where power was briefly equalized, where someone gave and someone took, and then moved on. Historians still argue whether the Lupanar should be seen as evidence of Roman depravity or resilience. Some call it proof of moral decay. Others see it as an early chapter in the long, unbroken history of labor and survival. And both might be right. Because if this brothel teaches you anything, it's that the oldest trade in the world wasn't born from lust. It was born from imbalance, from hunger, from negotiation. And let's not pretend we've outgrown it. The modern world just wears better shoes. In some cities, brothels are digital now, booked through apps, screened through algorithms. In others, they're still illegal, but more lucrative than ever, folded into nightlife, travel, even diplomacy. The tools have changed. Velvet is now LED lighting, handwritten ledgers replaced with secure payment portals, but the emotional math is identical. Desire, control, escape. One haunting echo of the past lives on in Amsterdam's red light district, where behind glass windows, women sit under neon, displayed like products but also watching the watchers. The glass is newer, the city cleaner, but the gaze is ancient. And the performances, like those of Pompeii, still rely on masks, one for the customer, one for the worker, and one for the law. And then there's your final quirky tidbit. A 20th century excavation in Pompeii uncovered a locked drawer in a brothel room, untouched for centuries. Inside, not gold, not love letters, just a worn sandal, a perfume vial, and a folded cloth with a faded flower stitched into the corner. It wasn't a treasure hoard, it was someone's knitstand. Someone who lived here, worked here, probably hoped to leave, and didn't. That cloth is now in a museum, cataloged as Textile Fragment 41B. But to someone, once it was everything. And here's one last story, short and strange. In 1987, a local guide fell asleep on a bench near the Lupaner after giving his 5th tour of the day. He dreamed he saw a woman in a tunic walking through the halls, whispering names in a language he didn't understand. When he woke up, he said he felt like he'd been watched. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the fact remains places like this don't forget. They just wait. So as you stand beneath the broken ceiling, feeling the sunlight touch the floor where shadows once sprawled, you understand something rare. You haven't just toured history, you've touched the soft underbelly of empire, the part they tried to erase. The brothel outlived marble temples and gilded palaces not because it was sacred, but because it was needed. The empire fell. The popes came and went. Plagues, wars, revolutions, nothing stopped the basic truth that somewhere, someone would trade their body for coin. And someone else would accept the offer. And now in the quiet, you feel a strange peace. Not because the story ended well, it didn't, but because it didn't end at all. And as you walk away from the ruins, passing tour groups and selfie sticks, the thought lingers, somewhere in a room not much different from this one. Someone is still whispering, still waiting, still working. Now take a slow breath. Let your shoulders soften. The ruins are behind you now, and all that's left is the hush of memory stone cooling under a setting sun. Old secrets settling into the dust. No more footsteps, no more whispers. Just the soft ache of knowing something that most people never will. That beneath all the great empires and noble histories, there were places like this. Humble, hidden, and very human. And maybe tonight, knowing that makes your own heartbeat feel a little less alone. You've wandered far through time and shadow, so let it go for now. Close your eyes. Let the quiet return. End of script. Sweet dreams.